Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Engage in the Future webinar with Bernard Allen today. It's great to see so many people here. I think we've got 43 in the meeting at the moment, and we've got another 10 more or so expected. I'm really aware that we've got some Engage school partners here and others who are not in Engage, so a big welcome to you. If you don't know too much about Engage, get on the website, do some research. We're a very friendly organisation, offers a lot of support to schools right across the country in every designation. So welcome, and without any further ado, if you can make sure that you're all muted, please. We are going to use the chat box for any questions. My co-chair, so I'm Richard Berry, co-chair of Engage in the Future. Sue Ackroyd, my co-chair, will field the questions. And I'm going to introduce Sharon Gray now, who's a member of the National Committee, to introduce Bernard.
Right. Well, hello and welcome to everybody. Many faces that we do know, but as Richard Berry has said, some faces that we don't know who possibly aren't members of Engage, but you're very, very welcome to join us. And certainly, if you're not members of Engage, it would be great for you to introduce yourselves through the chat and tell us where you're from in terms of the educational setting that you are working in, and of course ask any questions on the chat that we'll put forward to Bern later on. So the format this afternoon is Bernard is going to talk through some of the work that he's been doing before we will then put questions forward. As we know, COVID-19, the pandemic has had and is having the capacity to affect every person in the world, and how each individual responds will and can potentially affect everyone else. In addition to the efforts of courageous health workers, first responders, and a wide range of other workers providing vital services, countless numbers of selfless individuals are leaping into action to meet the rapidly changing needs of people most affected by the economic, social, and health impact of the crisis. And we at Engage and our wider collegiate wish to honour and support the extraordinary efforts of our colleagues across our family of schools who are working tirelessly to assure the availability of essential services whilst focusing attention on the many challenges facing our staff teams, our children, and of course their families as well. And as the entire planet has almost stopped to breathe for a moment and then sped up very quickly, even hold breath at times, waiting to see what unfolds, there are people who have the capacity to lean into the future, and by holding a common purpose can support the unfolding by gaining a sense of what's new and what's needed. And again, we believe the Engage in their schools community, in partnership and collaboration with the National Association of Special Schools, the CEO being Claire Dora, can work together to really support each other in that mission. Bern today is going to be talking about risk assessment and safeguarding. Now we know, as he's already said, in legal cases, the test of what constitutes good practice is whether a particular course of action would be supported by a reasonable body of professional opinion. And again, in drawing together with such an experienced group to face these challenges, Engage and NAS collegiately can work together to support to become that reasonable body. We know at these times there are no experts in this position, because we've heard the word again and again, it's unprecedented times. But I think Engage, and generally we are very lucky to have someone like Bernard Allen working with us, alongside us, as he has for many, many years. Bernard is an exceptional individual whose collective experience and journey determines he's absolutely, we know, the most credible authority in respect of risk in the education sector. He's an expert witness, regularly commissioned for prosecution and defence in the world of claims and litigation, and he's passionate about children and wanting the best for them, as are we all are. His credibility is clear. A few years back, his degree studies were in psychology, and his subsequent teaching career took him to the pinnacle of challenge, leading schools for children experiencing significant social, emotional, mental health difficulties. And in that, we note the lack of reference to behaviour. Bernard has strong views on this. Having stepped out of headship, he returned to his roots in psychology taken advantage of the new online forum of being able to converse with the world's experts. Bernard refers to himself on his website as a geek, and he is the most profound geek I think many of us have ever known, and that's for sure. But Bern's geekness and stoical determination rests in the pursuit of integrity and truth. He faces down institutional myths and practices through his own thinking and research. And most of all, he does this not only from a perspective of being a superb academic, but against the backdrop of credibility and implementation. Most of his career, he was a teacher and subsequently a head teacher. And to many of us, he's been an incredible support and a friend. So Bern, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sharon.
Pleasure.
Am I up yet?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So a renowned geek, eh? I'll live with that. My job as an expert in court actually isn't about telling people what I think is good practice. And I know there's some good stuff coming on Wednesday from Professor Barry Carpenter and Sharon about the things we can do to improve practice as we move forward into different times here. What I'm asked to do is tell people what a reasonable body of professional opinion thinks is good practice. And the principle is called the Bolam principle, after a crazy psychiatrist who decided it was best to give people ECT by giving them shocks without muscle relaxants or ties. And a patient flew off the table, hit the ceiling, and then landed and broke his hips. But at the time, all you needed to do was show that you can gather some other people who'd say that's all right, and that's a defense. Since then, there's a new legal bit come in, which says that you've also got to convince the judge that there's some common sense involved. And that's really what we're looking at here, just some common sense. But in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, I'm going to be writing reports on events that haven't happened yet, that'll be happening over this coming year. And what we can do, hopefully, is by being part of this meeting, what we can say is that a reasonable body of professional opinion has agreed with the sort of things that we're saying are reasonable for leaders. So it's strength in numbers. So I would ask people to think about joining Engage and being part of a group. The bigger the group, the more we've got. First things, I was asked about the guidance that came out last week. We're expected to keep up with guidance. There were 31 new documents issued last week between the 25th and 29th, 18 of them on Friday after 4 o'clock. Don't bother, is what I'd say. What they're actually all about is the government have been furiously adding to the Coronavirus 2020 Act disapplications of all the rules. It's really trying to give people a bit of leeway. So whereas it would once parents get punished for attendance, schools get punished for attendance, it's disapplied. Ofsted's disapplied from its requirements to do all its inspections. Registration, technically people who've taken kids in from other schools are breaching the regulations. It's disapplied, it's okay. Your own school policies can apply to those kids. EHC plans, expectations are just disapplied. It's all part of the same act. I would say if there's anyone in a residential provision, have a quick look at the isolation responses for residential provision guidance. But for the rest of it, the message going forward really, I think is quite a good one because we're being given some leeway to use our best professional practice and to explore our ways out of this, and we should take advantage of that. School leaders have legal powers and duties. The word reasonable endeavours has appeared across all of that guidance last week, so we may as well stick it in our own risk assessments. We're using our best reasonable endeavours to do the best we can under trying circumstances. Expert witnesses. When I first started doing expert witness work, I assumed that the sort of cases that ended up in court would be very different, exceptional ones. And a big learn for me was they're not. They're really quite routine. The only difference is the outcome. And very often when people find themselves involved in these cases, it's just traps that people have fallen into. And they're often the same traps, and people keep falling into the same traps. So again, one of the things we can do as we go through today is just have a look at some of the common ones and make sure that we can avoid them. I mentioned the Bolam test. Don't confuse general guidance, which comes from the centre, with detailed local guidance, which we have to write ourselves. I think sometimes as leaders, when we lack confidence, we get worried if we're not following the guidance. And we've seen that particularly recently with the Cummings affair, this idea that everybody has to follow the exact letter. That actually is a stupid way of addressing the law. What you want in a legal case is to show that you've thought about things and acted reasonably. So if there's national guidance that really is hard for us to apply, don't put it in your own guidance and wish it was true. Just explain that having assessed it, there are reasons why in our particular context that guidance isn't the best thing for children, and then explain, and that's our decision. And if there's a reasonable body of professional opinion who'll back that up, and that's this group we've got here today, that is what good practice is. We're defining good practice as we go, if we like. One of the problems we have got at the moment, I think, is that a lot of people are a bit anxious about using their own judgment, and we need to encourage both staff and children, I think, to do that. People under pressure do tend to want to be told what to do, and they'll tend to become obedient and look for strong leaders. That's an issue for us all politically, I think, as well. But our job is to keep educating colleagues and children to have the confidence to think about risk assessment themselves and do their own risk assessments. When people are judged in court cases, it's often their thought processes that are being questioned. They're being asked, so why did you do what you did? Of the options that were available, why did you choose the option you chose? And if we help people to think through those processes, and we make sure that our own documentation guides them through the same thinking process, then we'll reduce significantly the chance of us ending up in these cases. As I said, very often they're traps people have set themselves. It's tempting to cut and paste references to all the guidance. It's a trap, actually. I often, I'm sent all the guidance of a school when something's happened. And if they've given me guidance, I have to comment on what the guidance said. And often the trap is there's guidance saying that we do one thing, and in this case, we didn't do it. So had they not claimed to do that, they would have been fine. They've set their own trap. I'll give you a clear example. In the education world, we quantify resources in terms of staffing ratios because it's convenient. But be very careful about putting staffing ratios in your policies, because if you're claiming that someone needs 2-to-1 support all the time, and there's a moment when they don't have 2 people next to them, that is the court case. And I've often had to explain that 2-to-1 means that if it's needed, it's got to be available, but it doesn't mean you're always putting extra bodies in. Another mistake is, for instance, to be always arguing that more staff was the answer. When you're talking about hazardous behavior, for instance, more staff equals more target areas. So it actually increases risk. And that's relevant to the coronavirus too. More people exposed to a hazard are more people put at risk of the hazard. So be careful about those sort of general claims that are made in policies. I'd say a basic guidance is think and then think about the best interest and then show that you've balanced risks. Michael Gove told Andrew Marr last week on Sunday, I think, that teachers and children will be absolutely safe in school. That's not a very smart thing to say. Nobody's absolutely safe. And it's never been true, and it never will be true. But what we can recognize is that there is no zero risk. The current status isn't zero risk either. And I think we've got to acknowledge people are already being harmed by the restrictions. Some people are suffering more than others. I think some people are quite keen to get back to work, others less so, and that'll be going for the children as well. I don't know whether people saw the reports from zoos around the world about the way animals have been reacting to the lockdown. Penguins and elephants are much happier, apparently. Elephants are less constipated because they didn't used to like to go to the water butts where people photographed them all the time. There's an issue there to think about. The big cats love it when there aren't humans around them and they're starting to mate, which they don't normally do in zoos. But it's the primates that are really struggling, and the primates seem depressed, and they're saying that the primates are missing people. And of course, we're primates too. We know that vulnerable people become more vulnerable in lockdown. We know there's domestic violence issues, there's mental and physical health. We've got to balance those risks against the risks of any other options we've got. As a general rule, we do know that children statistically are at greater risk at home than they are at school by a long way. And we also know how important it is for their physical and mental well-being for them to be able to interact with peers and carers and teachers, and that's in the current guidance too. So by depriving them of social contact and education, we're exposing them to risk. And that's particularly true for children with social and emotional health needs. Norway, when it was considering reopening schools, and one of the and again, a risk assessment for us all is to acknowledge that several countries have already opened since the 11th of May, and they're doing all right. But Norway is the only one I think I know of that's done a mathematical calculation of the risks, and it calculated the costs of school closure. And they came up with a very clear conclusion that every week of school closure was going to stunt life chances for these children and permanently lower salaries in the future. And that's why they're questioning now whether they were right to go into closure at the very beginning. All these sort of things can be put into our risk assessments to show that we've thought through all of these issues when we've made our decisions about when and how to open. I mentioned Norway, the Netherlands, France, Denmark and Norway all opened up on May the 11th. Sweden, of course, never shut. As I said, there's no such thing as absolute safety. What we can say clearly, I would put it into our risk assessments, is that we know that if you're between the ages, well, if you're below the age of 60, which people have talked about quite a bit, the actual chances of someone dying if they get COVID-19 in the next year are less than the chances of them dying of other things. And that's something people aren't thinking about. Even if you're over 60, for the between 60 and 80, the odds of most people dying after getting COVID-19 are only slightly higher than the risk of them dying of something else during the same period. And I haven't really seen that explained very clearly. We do know that children are about half as likely to get it as adults. And again, that should be it should be in the risk assessments that we've considered these things and we're looking for the evidence. We know that frontline medical staff are statistically no more likely to get it than members of the general population, again, which was all risk assessments that were a bit counterintuitive, if you like. One thing that is relevant, I think, for staffing, we need to consider BAME Britons, and the statistical evidence is saying very clearly that BAME Britons are no more likely to die of COVID-19 than anyone else once other factors such as diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure are taken into account. It will be important to encourage people to do their own risk assessments and take their own medical advice for training and for professional activities too on that. For people interested in the statistics, for children of school age, the survival rate of COVID is 99.99%, and it is far below the risk of other things. As soon as children leave school, the risks of other things rocket far higher than this, particularly for young men who are a bit careless. And they only come back together again when you're about 100 years old. The odds of dying of everything is about the same for men, women, and everyone. By about my age, if you're in your late 60s or late-ish 60s, you've got a 99% survival rate if you get COVID, but that's exactly the same as your survival rate anyway. And that's what people just don't think about normally. They don't like to think about that. Okay, I think it's important that we get the language right too. If we don't, correct language, who will? All over the guidance over COVID for schools, they've been talking about face-to-face contact. Let's get that out. We want to avoid face-to-face contact, face-to-face projections. We've been talking about social distancing. I know Sue's talked about this. Let's get that out of the language too. We want to enable social contact. What we're trying to do is introduce physical distancing, and we've got to balance those. So I'm going to just give 20 safety tips, if you like, and then throw it open to questions. And if anything comes up, I'll try to answer that as best I can. I do have slides hundreds of slides on this, and I'm quite happy to pull them together and share them if the questions relate to any of those. So let's just go through 20 quick things to think about. These aren't things you must do. What I'd say is do the thought experiment, and in 3 years' time, I will be in court being asked to criticize people about things that will happen in all of your schools, but I'm just hoping you'll be the lucky ones who don't end up getting blamed for it. And it's much easier when someone they will inevitably say the one thing you didn't do is the obvious cause of everything that went wrong. And my job, if I'm defending people, as often I am, if I can say, well, they did this and they did that, and they tried this and they tried that, you just tire the judge out. And at the end of it, you're saying, okay, no one gets everything 100% right, but these people, they use their best endeavors. And there's the wording of our current guidance. Someone is keen on that at the moment. And they took reasonably practicable steps. What more do you expect people to do? And if you're saying, a reasonable body of professional opinion would say that that's good enough. And it's not claiming to be the best practice. So let's just think of what of this 20 we could do. I'd say for protection, I'm seeing some people up here who are trainers who I know, and these go as well. These go for our training as well. It's about sharing responsibility. One is get workers and visitors to sign their own declaration that they think they're fit to work, and a declaration that they're willing to follow the policies and protect everyone. And that involves the trace and contact policies. I think there probably is a duty for employers when it's hard to get to these testing facilities to enable them to get there or give them transport in some way, but it's an expectation that people are going to follow all the protocols. We know about creating physical distance areas. I think people are well up for that. We also know we need to mark these out, because anyone who's been in a park this weekend can see that very few people have any concept of what 2 meters is. So we need to mark and measure. We need to rearrange furniture to avoid face-to-face and maintain distances in that way. These are all the measures that all the other countries have adopted too. So if you want a reasonable body, we're talking about an international consensus amongst professionals now. We can create one-way systems, that's clear. We can create new spaces outdoors if possible, and think about covers for bad weather. And I'm thinking about the sort of things that pubs had to do when they had to set up smokers areas outside, more places for people to go, whereas they normally would have been close indoors with people. We know outdoors safer. Not my normal stance on this where we come to behavior, but I would say in the current climate, we need to take the pressure off. We need to take the pressure off everybody and give a bit of leeway. We can re-establish the norms a bit later, and that's for staff and for children too, because this is risk management. Keep groups small is clearly what we're expected to do. Avoid large gatherings. And again, I'm just thinking forward. When I'm in court, I'm often thinking when someone is bellowing that somebody's negligent, blimey, I would have done that. But let's just think about what you need to do is explain why it was necessary. So say inevitably somebody will catch something over the next 3 years, and they're going to say, I want compensation from you. I want my £300,000, please, because you negligently put me at risk by making me go to a large gathering. And what was this large gathering? Well, it was 200 people in an assembly. And you've got to come up, why was that necessary? Why the large gathering? And it may be that it's necessary, but have a reason and show that you've thought through the risk assessment process and ended up in the right place. Generally, the rule is we want to reduce movement around buildings. That's been international good practice. Establishing staggered shifts for starts, endings, and communal areas is common practice now across all the countries that have just opened. Enhanced cleaning and recording the cleaning like they do in service stations and pubs, I think is a good idea too. Providing bin liners and tapes so that clothing that may be infected in some way can be bagged up and taken home. Encouraging some people to change at work and go home in different clothing is sensible. PPE, be careful. The recommendation is not for masks in schools as a general practice. We know that some places do need PPE. The law on this is clear. If you say to staff that there's a requirement for any sort of personal protective equipment, you've just accepted the legal responsibility for buying it and providing it for them. This came from a case where a local authority told lone workers that they needed to wear non-slip fitments on their shoes when it was icy, and someone fell over, and the court said it wasn't enough under health and safety to tell them what to do. If you think it's necessary, you have to buy it. That's what health and safety is. So be very careful about saying to people, you need to have this, 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 and this, because you've set a trap for yourself. What would you do if your policy is we don't need masks and a member of staff is anxious and they want to wear masks? I would be very, very reluctant in the current climate, because there's so much uncertainty, to be telling anyone to do anything. If they want to wear a mask, I'd be saying, well, I don't think it's necessary, but of course, if you're more comfortable wearing a face covering, then that's what you can do. Consider buying reasonably practicable items. They don't work, but it's back to that idea that it's partly evidence that you're leaning over backwards to use your best reasonable endeavors. In Asia, all over Asia, since the SARS, and I was working in Asia at that time, they've got temperature guns at airports and stuff. It tells you very little apart from how warm someone is at that moment, but they're only 30 quid. And if people are happier to have those, why not have them? I don't know whether people have seen these little brass grabbers. They're only a couple of quid. You can get them from Amazon. They're for pressing buttons or for pulling taps or toilet doors or something. I don't think people will always use them. The copper in them means they're antiviral. There is actually some science in them. But again, there's also a little project for secondary schools making these and going into business. But it's not much, but it's something that people may want. Other lessons from Asia is during the SARS, I was interested to notice all the lift buttons were covered every day with cling film and tape. That's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about silicone covers for keyboards and that sort of thing. Again, it's not that these are all desperately necessary. It's all the things we can do to show that we're thinking as imaginatively as we can. I'd also consider investing in soft washable mats for sitting outdoors if we're asking people to do that. And I'm a great advocate of washable. They have to be these robust washable outdoor bean bags. They cost about 30, 40 quid. And again, washable's the key, but being able to set up ad hoc outside places and to have the flexibility of moving people around might be helpful too. Provide current and prospective staff with accurate information on the relative risks. I've been talking about that. I think it's important that we are open and honest and are sharing the information so that people are encouraged to do their own personal risk assessments. All staff should be advised formally to take appropriate medical advice before they do their declaration. And a final warning, I'd be careful, pay due regard to the Equalities Act 2010. And I'm thinking, I was initially thinking about, before I actually found out about the risk to older people, which is where I started, I was foreseeing people in the future bringing cases by saying, look, I'm in my late 50s, I should have been kept away from all risk because I'm more vulnerable. And we know that the increased statistical likelihood of BAME people having worse reactions to this could also possibly introduce people who are saying, I should have been given extra protections. But it goes the other way. I think you've got to be very careful. Remember that statistics is only about whole populations, not individuals. So you can't generalize. So you can't have policies and I'm talking here about recruitment or any other policy that is making generalizations like that. You can simply give people the accurate information, and as an individual, each individual has their own medical history, and that's the key. So don't have general rules. Okay, I'm gonna stop there, and then hopefully we'll leave about half an hour for any questions if anyone's got any.